Hello, everyone. Mm, Something just occurred in a space you weren't part of, didn't it? A conversation where your name came up, where you were discussed, where opinions about you were shared or decisions about you were made. And you're picking up on the energetic residue of that exchange, even though you weren't physically present to hear the words spoken, even though nobody's told you yet what was said. Let me share what I'm perceiving in the acoustic imprints surrounding you right now. The first thing breaking through is this distinct sensation you might be experiencing of being talked about. You could be picking up on that peculiar awareness that comes when your name enters someone else's mouth, when you become subject of discussion in rooms you're not in, when narratives about you are being constructed or confirmed or challenged by people whose perspectives on you carry weight. You might be sensing disturbance in the energetic field, like ripples spreading outward from stone dropped in still water, and those ripples are reaching you even though you can't see the stone or identify exactly where it landed. Here's what you could be observing in your immediate sensory experience. You might be noticing sudden, unexplained shifts in your emotional state, anxiety spiking without clear trigger, excitement bubbling up from nowhere, heaviness settling over you that doesn't match your immediate circumstances. And what if those emotional weather changes aren't random but responsive? What if you're picking up on energetic transmissions from conversation happening about you, feeling echoes of words being spoken is less than has hone? Zero hash is greater than experiencing secondhand emotional content before you receive firsthand information about what was actually said. What's reverberating through the social infrastructure is that you could be dealing with a conversation that significantly impacts how you're perceived or positioned. You might be sensing that what was discussed wasn't casual mention, but substantive exchange, the kind where people who influence your opportunities or relationships were comparing notes, sharing assessments, making determinations about your character or your value or your place in various contexts. You could be picking up on evaluative energy, awareness of being measured, considered, judged in your absence, and that vulnerability of being subject to others' interpretations without ability to represent yourself is activating primal discomfort about exposure and powerlessness. This reflection invites you to consider what you fear most about what might have been said and whether that fear reveals insecurities about how you're actually perceived or anxieties about being seen accurately for who you truly are, which are very different concerns requiring different responses. You might be noticing that you're experiencing curiosity warring with dread. You could be picking up on desperate desire to know exactly what was said, to hear precise words, to understand context and tone, to have complete information so you can assess threat or opportunity accurately. But you might also be sensing that not knowing protects you in a certain way, that as long as content remains mysterious, you can imagine best case scenarios, can avoid confronting potentially painful truths about how others see you or what they think you're capable of or deserving of. What's pulsing through the communicative networks is that you could be dealing with the conversation that was protective of you rather than critical. You might be picking up on energy of someone speaking favorably about you, defending your reputation, advocating for your interests, presenting you in light that serves rather than sabotages your goals. You could be sensing that what was said increased rather than diminished your standing, that someone used their social capital to elevate yours, and that unexpected alliance or support from source you might not have anticipated is creating possibility you didn't know existed. What's particularly interesting about what I'm witnessing is that you might be approaching secondhand confirmation of things you've suspected but couldn't verify. You could be sensing that conversation revealed information about how specific people truly feel about you, clarifying ambiguous relationships, exposing hidden agendas, or validating instincts you've been doubting. You might be picking up on truth emerging through chain of communication, where what was said to one person is going to reach you eventually through mutual connections. And that approaching clarity about where you actually stand with various people is both relieving and destabilizing, because certainty eliminates comfortable ambiguity you've been operating within. You might be observing that you're hyper analyzing recent interactions for clues. You could be experiencing yourself reviewing conversations you've had, looking for hints about who might have been discussing you, trying to piece together what prompted this particular exchange, scanning for behavioral changes in people around you that might signal they know something you don't. You might be picking up on your own investigative impulses, that desire to gather intelligence, to regain control through information, and recognizing that spiral of speculation as anxiety response rather than productive inquiry helps you interrupt pattern before it consumes too much mental bandwidth. What's threading through the gossip matrices is that you could be dealing with conversation that revealed unexpected dimension of someone's regard for you. You might be sensing that what was said exposed feelings someone's been concealing, depth of care they haven't expressed directly, investment in your well being that goes beyond what surface interactions would suggest. You could be picking up on someone having claimed you in social sphere, having identified themselves as connected to you, protective of you, concerned with your welfare in ways that position you differently in collective awareness. And that shift in how you're held by others is creating opportunities or complications you're starting to sense even without explicit knowledge. This reflection invites you to consider whether you've been underestimating how much you matter to certain people, and what changes for you if you accept that your impact on others is deeper and more positive than your self concept has allowed you to believe. You might be noticing that you're experiencing vulnerability about being discussed without your participation. You could be picking up on violation inherent in being made object rather than subject, in having your story told by others who may not have complete information, who might prioritize their narrative convenience over your truth. You might be sensing powerlessness that comes when your reputation is being shaped by voices other than your own. And that discomfort with lack of control over how you're represented is legitimate, even if the specific content discussed turns out to be benign or even beneficial. What's also surfacing is that you could be dealing with conversation that was prompted by someone seeking advice about you. You might be sensing that what was discussed wasn't gossip, but genuine consultation. Someone trying to understand you better, to navigate relationship with you more skillfully, to determine appropriate next steps and dynamic with you. You could be picking up on earnestness rather than malice, awareness that you were subject of conversation because you matter enough to warrant thoughtful consideration, and that seriousness with which someone else is taking their connection to you is information about their investment, even if you're not yet clear on specifics. The resonant harmonics suggest you might be experiencing this as connected to larger themes of visibility and exposure in your life right now. You could be sensing that being talked about privately is microcosm of bigger pattern, where you're becoming more visible generally, where more people are aware of you, where your name is circulating in contexts beyond your direct control. You might be picking up on growth requiring you to release illusion of privacy, to accept that as you expand your presence or influence or connections, you necessarily become subject of others' discussions, and making peace with that reality is part of maturation process. What's significant is that you could be approaching moment where what was said reaches you directly. You might be sensing that information is traveling toward you through networks, that someone who was part of conversation or who heard about it secondhand is going to share details with you. You could be picking up on approaching revelation that will answer questions while probably generating new ones. Because knowing what was said often leads to wondering why, to questioning motives, to needing additional context to fully metabolize the information. This reflection invites you to consider how you want to respond when information reaches you. Whether you want to confront, to ignore, to investigate further, and what your choice of response reveals about your priorities around controlling your narrative versus trusting that truth has its own way of establishing itself regardless of temporary misrepresentations. You might be picking up on this conversation having occurred between people whose opinions particularly matter to you. You could be sensing that it wasn't random acquaintances, but individuals whose perception of you carries weight, people who influence opportunities, people you respect or desire approval from, people whose regard affects your sense of security or belonging. You might be experiencing heightened stakes because of who was involved, and that specificity of concern is helping you identify which relationships actually hold power in your psyche, which voices you've granted authority to validate or invalidate you. What I'm witnessing in the social topographies is that you could be dealing with conversation that compared you to others. You might be sensing that what was discussed involved your relative position, how you measure up, what distinguishes you, where you excel or fall short in comparison to alternatives or competitors. You could be picking up on evaluative framework that positioned you within hierarchy. And while being ranked or assessed might feel reductive, it's also information about how you're perceived in larger ecosystem, about what value proposition you represent to people making choices about who to invest in, collaborate with, or prioritize. The vibrational signatures suggest you might be experiencing this as opportunity to practice detachment from others' perceptions. You could be sensing that regardless of what was said, whether flattering or critical, accurate or distorted, your actual worth remains unchanged. That others' discussions about you reveal more about them and their values and their concerns than about your essential nature. You might be picking up on spiritual test embedded in social situation, invitation to develop stability that doesn't depend on external validation, to build identity that isn't shaken by being subject of others' conversations because you know who you are independent of their conclusions. What's also coming through is that you could be dealing with conversation that attempted to protect someone else from you. You might be sensing that what was discussed involved warnings, cautionary tales, advice to maintain distance is less than #0. 5 is greater than energy of someone trying to shield another person from perceived danger or dysfunction or disruption you represent. You could be picking up on being cast as threat or problem, and that characterization, whether fair or unfair, activates defensive reactions alongside hurt about being misunderstood or misrepresented to people who might have been open to you had they not received prejudicial information. This reflection invites you to consider what part of you knows that criticism directed at you might contain grain of truth worth examining, and what part is rightfully rejecting distorted characterization that serves others' agendas rather than reflecting your actual impact or intentions. You might be noticing that you're experiencing urge to control narrative moving forward. You could be picking up on desire to preemptively shape how you're discussed, to be so consistently excellent or so carefully managed in your presentation that others have only positive things to say. But you might also be sensing exhaustion at thought of that level of self-monitoring. Recognizing that trying to be universally well regarded requires you to fragment yourself into versions that please different audiences, and that fragmentation costs more than occasional unfavorable conversation in spaces you can't control. What's pulsing through the probability fields is that you could be dealing with conversation that revealed alliance or opposition you didn't fully recognize before. You might be sensing that what was said exposed who's actually in your corner versus who presents friendly face while harboring reservations or resentments is less than #0. 5 is greater than, and that clarification of social terrain, while potentially painful, is ultimately valuable because it shows you where to invest your trust and where to maintain appropriate boundaries. You could be picking up on social realignment happening, where this conversation functioned as catalyst for people declaring where they stand relative to you, and those declarations are information you need even if receiving it stings. The acoustic residue suggests you might be experiencing this conversation as having shifted how others will interact with you going forward. You could be sensing that what was said created new context, that people who weren't thinking about you a certain way before are now primed to notice particular qualities or behaviors. You might be picking up on expectation being set, either positive or limiting, and that preconception others now carry is going to influence how they interpret your actions, creating self-fulfilling prophecies where you're seen through lens established by conversation rather than through clear, direct observation. What's threading through the interpersonal dynamics is that you could be dealing with someone who spoke about you because they're processing their own feelings. You might be sensing that what was said had more to do with their internal experience of you, their attraction, their envy, their gratitude, their confusion, than with objective assessment. You could be picking up on conversation as emotional processing rather than factual reporting. And recognizing that distinction helps you depersonalize content that might otherwise wound you, helps you understand it as information about their journey rather than verdict on your character. This reflection invites you to consider what freedom becomes available when you release need to know and control every conversation about you, and whether energy spent managing your reputation might be better invested in simply being authentic enough that your reputation takes care of itself through consistency of your actual presence. You might be observing that you're experiencing this as reminder of your interconnectedness. You could be picking up on awareness that you exist in web of relationships where you're always partially constructed by others' perceptions, where your identity is negotiated in conversations you're not part of, where reputation precedes and follows you through social networks. You might be sensing both constraint and possibility in that reality. Recognizing that while you can't fully control your social positioning, you also benefit from advocacy and positive regard spread through channels you don't personally activate. So, as you navigate sensing that conversation about you occurred without knowing specific content, practice staying grounded in what you actually know versus what you're imagining. You might be experiencing anxiety that manufactures worst case scenarios, that assumes criticism, betrayal, damaging revelation. But speculation isn't information, fear isn't prophecy. And projecting your insecurities onto unknown situation gives those insecurities power they don't deserve. Trust that if something truly important was said, it will reach you in time through appropriate channels. You might be impatient for immediate disclosure is less than #0. 5 hash is greater than. But information has its own pace, its own trajectory. What you need to know finds you. What doesn't reach you might not have been meant for you, or might arrive when you're better equipped to metabolize it. Practice patience with not knowing while also refusing to be consumed by it. Remember that being discussed is evidence of mattering. You might be experiencing vulnerability about being talked about. But people don't waste breath on those who are insignificant to them. Conversation, even uncomfortable conversation, signals that you've made impression, that you've affected people strongly enough that they need to process that effect through dialogue that's actually complement to your impact, even when substance of discussion might be complicated. Whatever was said, it doesn't define you. Others' words about you are just that, words, interpretations, projections colored by speakers' own histories and biases. You're not bound by their conclusions, and you don't need their permission to know your own worth or to continue being exactly who you are. Let them talk. Let the conversation unfold. And stay anchored in your own truth, regardless of what stories are being told about you in rooms you'll never enter. Your real work isn't managing those narratives, it's living so authentically that truth speaks louder than gossip, so consistently that your actual presence overwhelms any distorted version. So powerfully that what others say about you becomes irrelevant compared to what you demonstrate about yourself through how you show up. Day after day, in spaces where you actually have voice and agency and choice, that's where your power lives. Stay there.